Hey guys, Grumpy here with a guide to energy weapons. So this guide is going to cover the energy damage type, and then it's going to talk about the four groupings of energy weapons, the officer skills, and finally the hull mods that affect energy weapons. So what are energy weapons? They are way too varied to categorize them in one group. The one thing that kind of unifies most of them though is the energy damage type. This does 100% damage to shield, armor, and hulls. It has no bonuses, but it also has no penalties. What I like to use energy weapons for on the battlefield is specifically damaging the hull of a damaged ship. So I rely on ballistics and missiles to deal with the armor and the shields of a ship. And then my energy weapons are what actually destroys the enemy ship. So getting into the four groupings of energy weapons, you have your beam weapons, your blasters, your point defense, and then finally your EMP damage. Starting with beam weapons, these can generally be categorized as low flux, low damage with exceptional range. The trade-off though is they deal soft flux damage only. You can modify this with the hull mod, which we'll talk about at near the end of the video, but for the most part, they only deal soft flux damage. So even if you have the most range in the world, ultimately it doesn't matter if you can't force your opponent to lower their shields. For that reason, I strongly recommend you pair beam weapons with kinetic damage. Specifically, I recommend pairing them with something like a Gauss cannon, which has really long range, so it matches right nicely with your beam weapons, which also have long range, and deals double damage to shields. Moving on from there, you have your blasters. So blasters come in two variants. You have your budget blasters, those being your pulse laser, auto pulse laser, as well as your IR pulse laser. These are okay. I generally don't recommend them though. Instead, I recommend using your more hungry variants, those being the antimatter blaster, heavy blaster, and plasma cannon. Again, if we're using energy weapons to damage the opponent's hull, there's absolutely no reason why you would want to use a weaker variant. Instead, spend the flux, deal as much damage as you can while the opponent's shields are down. Hopefully you can destroy the ship. If not, you can cripple the ship and possibly force it off the battlefield. Moving on to point defense. Energy point defense is more expensive than the ballistic cousin. However, you get some really nice trade-offs, or you get really nice value in the form of longer ranges and more damage to fighters and missiles. Energy weapon is some of the best point defense in the game. And then when you scale it with hull mods and officer skills, which we'll talk about a little later, you get very nice value out of these. Finally, you have your EMP weapons. EMP weapon, they do low damage, but in exchange, they deal high EMP damage. EMP damage is a damage type specific for weapons and engines. Each weapon and engine has a specific amount of health. Your EMP damage checks against that health. If it exceeds it, then it knocks that weapon or engine system offline. What I like to use EMP weapons for is I like to spread them out. I like to put them on fast moving ships, so those being frigates or safety overrides destroyers. And I'll go harass a capital ship, which will isolate it on the corner of the battlefield while I deal with the main fleet. Once I destroy the main fleet, then I move my entire fleet over, and then we deal with whatever the biggest threat is over here. So those are the four groups of weapons. Moving on to the skills, there are quite a lot of skills that affect energy weapons. Everything highlighted here affects energy weapons in one way or another, save for navigation and bulk transport. You just need those to build up to the higher tiers. The ones that I want to focus on though are point defense, target analysis, energy weapon mastery, and electronic warfare. Four skills are really nice if you're going with a high-tech fleet that uses a lot of energy weapons. Point defense, again, like we talked about recently, this scales the amount of damage that you get from your point defense even further. It scales better than it would with ballistics, which typically have lower damage, so you get less value out of point defense. If you elite it, you get even more range, so you get ridiculous ranges. You get like 600, 700, 800 on your like average point defense, which is really nice. Then you have target analysis. So in general, it's just a really good perk. I recommend this on all of your officers. But the elite variant gives you 100% damage to weapons and engines. That 100% damage doubles the effectiveness of your EMP weapons. So your ion beam, instead of doing 400 EMP damage, does 800. Next up, you have electronic warfare. Electronic warfare is huge if you're building long-range fleets. So if you're utilizing a lot of beam weapons, then what electronic warfare is going to do is if you maximize it, it'll reduce your enemy's range by 10%. So combine this with sensor jammers, gunnery mastery, advanced optics, which we'll talk about a little later. Your beam weapons can get up to 2,000 range, which is a lot of coverage. And then finally, you have energy weapon mastery. If you attack opponents within 600 meters of your ship, you'll deal increased damage based on the amount of flux that your ship has. The card above demonstrates the Apogee. It demonstrates how to utilize energy weapon mastery to its fullest. Now finally, let's go over the hull mods. So there are quite a few hull mods that affect energy weapons. Of those, I want to talk about high scatter amplifier first. So I mentioned that you can convert your beam weapons from dealing only soft flux to dealing hard flux. You do that with high scatter amplifier. That said, this is a really, really, really bad hull mod, and it is extreme bait. I do not recommend you take high scatter amplifier. It is one of the worst hull mods for what it does. Let's go ahead and read it. High scatter amplifier reads, beam weapons deal 10% more damage and deal hard flux damage to shields. It reduces the portion of the range of beam weapons that is above 200 units by 50%. The base range is affected. Dealing more damage with beam weapons, that's okay. Dealing hard flux damage to beam weapons, to shields, that's also good. The drawback is so absolutely devastating though, that this is not even worth considering. The whole point of your beam weapon is to be a long range threat. Anything you can do with high scatter amplifier is undermined as soon as you apply another energy weapon, or even better, a ballistic weapon that does kinetic damage to a ship. Your high intensity laser does 250 damage per second to shields. With 10% more damage, it does 275 damage per second to shields at a significantly reduced range. We're talking about like 600 range out of this beam weapon. You know what else is 600 range? That does more than 275 damage per second to an opponent's shield. How about a hypervelocity driver? This is a range of 1000, deals damage of 275, which is doubled 550. Like, why would you use high scatter amplifier reducing the range of your high intensity laser to get 275 damage when you can just use a hypervelocity driver that does way better in every aspect? It even imparts EMP damage. So the fact that ballistic weapons exist completely undermines high scatter amplifier. You don't need it. It's going to just neuter your energy weapons, so do not pick it. We have integrated point defense AI. This is phenomenal. So this increases the amount of damage that your point defense is doing to missiles. Again, that scales just like the point defense skill does. So it's really nice there. And then we have our defensive hull mods. So solar shielding reduces the amount of energy damage you take just across the board by 10%. And resistant flux conduit reduces the amount of EMP damage you take by 50%. So if you're going against high-tech fleets, you really want to look to see if you can wedge in solar shieldings for sure, and possibly resistant flux conduits, maybe on like your capital ships or cruisers or whatever pivotal ship you need in order to succeed in your strategy. You don't need resistant flux conduits, let's say on a Griffin, because that's typically going to be in your backline, really long range. But on like an Eradicator, it might make all the difference in the world if you can't penetrate the enemy's line with said ship. Then you have integrated targeting unit. Again, if you're stacking range modifiers on like your beam weapons, you really want ITU. This is going to extend the range significantly. Then finally, you have advanced optics. So unlike high scatter amplifier, advanced optics is what you want to be applying to your beam weapons. This gives you another 200 range. The drawback on this though is It reduces the turn rate of your beam weapons by 30%. Sounds really devastating, but one, you can undermine it with advanced turret gyros. So that already covers the drawback. But even more so, just physically, if you're using beam weapons in a hardpoint, it doesn't matter what their turn rate is, right? Because you can just turn the ship. And if you use it on the sides, even still, typically your beam weapons are locked on to a big target. So that being like another capital ship or a cruiser, something that's slow moving and at a really long distance. So having to turn doesn't really matter that much. Just give your capital ship, like your Paragon, an engage command or eliminate command, and it's just going to stay locked onto that target. It's not really going to switch. Where it will debilitate you a little is switching from target to target. However, it shouldn't really be doing that often. Like if you have frigates close to your Paragon, well, you should be screening with your destroyers to destroy those frigates. So really, it's not even that big of an issue. That's a quick guide to energy weapons. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. I'll be happy to answer them. Other than that, Grumpy out.